Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome Jason Louv to the show. Jason is an occultist, author, and journalist. He joins us today to talk about his latest book, John Dee and the Empire of Angels. Along the way, we cover the prevalence of magic in Elizabethan England, the influence of Enochian on the story of Western ritual magic, and the role of the extradimensional in world politics. Great chat. Quick note before we begin, there are a couple of audio dropouts that weren't apparent to me when we were recording, so it might go quiet for a second in one or two places. Apologies for that, but the conversation is easily picked back up. And speaking of conversations, let's have one. Jason, welcome aboard.
Hello, Gordon. How you doing?
I'm doing well. And I have a bit of a curveball first question for you, Jason.
Okay, shoot.
All right. Was John Dee a weird kid?
Was John Dee a weird kid? Yes, he absolutely was. He was mathematical and recognized from a very young age. But he grew up in he grew up in a mercantile family. So his father was a gentleman sewer to the king, and so he grew up surrounded by numbers in a business sense and math. But he was a weird kid, not only at that stage because he was so interested in math, but he stuck out like a sore thumb in England at that time because he was what we would recognize now as a STEM student. He was kind of like an engineering, IT, math type kid. And at this time, England was very much, the English Academy was very much interested in humanism, which was, of course, the study of Plato and Aristotle and the manuscripts that had been brought back from the sack of the Byzantine Empire into the Medici city-states. And so everyone was very interested in the soft sciences and humanism and studying the classics at this time. And John Dee wanted to study mathematics, hard science, and the occult. And in order to do that, he had to leave England. That's how much he stuck out, and study at the University of Louvain, no relation to me, I think, in the Netherlands. Well, where he was able to learn that stuff.
Yeah, it's funny you mention that because I remember when I took a sort of before launch tour of the Royal College of Physicians Dee exhibit a couple of years ago. There are some documents that Dee was penning while he was at Louvain, and it really speaks to what you were saying about the STEM approach. Like I was thinking in advance of this podcast, kind of what a modern version of that personality type would be. And I landed on, see what you think of this, I landed on Dr. Russell Targ because he's very, as you say, STEM and mathematically oriented, but he's almost so STEM that he doesn't especially care that you have something like materialism range binding what you would study. Because I remember looking at these documents of him patiently matching and recording the weather of the day while he's in the Low Countries to the astrological conditions, and he abandoned this project, presumably because there was no correlation. So you see him there just going, okay, I'm going to see if there's a system here I can work at, and he's just building this database, and it looks so bizarre to us because it's a combination of meteorology and astrology, but why wouldn't it be? Like this is the examining, inquiring mind, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And that's one of the reasons why I think Dee is so fascinating to study. And by the way, I checked out that exhibit also. And one of the things, which was an amazing exhibit, and one of the things that I noticed is that Dee still sticks out as a weird kid. You could almost tangibly feel the Royal College of Physicians trying to, say, well, he was into this magic stuff, but, we're all kind of quirky sometimes, and we don't take this stuff too seriously. So it's amazing that he's getting all this attention now, but people are still have often been at pains to distance themselves from his occultism in many, I think, to preserve their own professional reputations, which is one of the reasons that I've written this book, is to show that these were not separate for him.
Well, I was kind of teasing the curator about that because she was squeamish about a lot of things about Dee. She was squeamish about his spying. She was squeamish about the magic stuff. And you're right, he does kind of stick out. And if you look at the RCP's library collection, there's this great big chunk of Dee, and then it's early modern English medical documents otherwise, and they don't really know what to do with him. And they even, if you've been to the exhibit, they were at pains to mention that he was never a member of the Royal College of Physicians. They've just got his book. So centuries later, they're still saying like, well, he's kind of interesting, but we'll keep him at arm's length because he's a bit too weird for us.
Right. The conclusion that I came to about this, though, is if you really stop to think about this, it's actually quite kind of disingenuous and intellectually dishonest in a way. And that I think that if we're going to study something fully, and what I say in this book, in John Dee and the Empire of Angels, is that, look, if you're going to study Dee, you have to at least understand how he saw himself and understand his context. Don't go in with the scalpel and start dividing up his areas of interest. To understand Dee, we have to understand that the Renaissance Hermetic thinkers and Neoplatonists and the occult thinkers of Dee's day did not make any type of distinction between the different intellectual fields of study, and it was all one thing for them: the study of reality and the nature of God and spiritual reality. And so to kind of look at that from our modern perspective and impose our modern prejudices on it is quite disingenuous, I think. I mean, okay, it's one thing to, at the end of studying him, say, well, I don't personally believe in the occult. Okay, that's one thing, but you can't, take any subject and impose your prejudices on it to the point that you miss the point of who he was and what he was trying to do.
Yeah, it's Bruce Wayne without Batman. You can't get a clear picture of him, and I think that's one of the reasons why he remains an enigma, and also people have struggled to encapsulate him in books. So there have been, previous biographies. Queen's Conjurer is a reasonably good one, but again, it's not written from a practitioner perspective.
Right.
So
Glenn Perry's biography is excellent. The Archconjurer of England. Yeah. I think that's probably the best one. Yeah. The problem that I was trying to solve with this book, the problem that I faced, is that there's obviously been a ton of literature on Dee from the academic side and then also from the occult side. But with some exceptions, what we have tended to see is on the academic side is people doing what we've just been talking about and just kind of keeping perhaps not even writing about the occult stuff, even though it occupied basically Dee's entire life, and only writing about his political and scientific and imperial work. And then on the other side of the fence, we have people who are writing simply about Enochian magic and the occult system, which is wonderful, and yet also does not include the broader context of the geopolitics of the day, the science, the fact that it, very directly linked into everything else that Dee was doing. And there have been some exceptions to this, most notably Nicholas Cluley and then Deborah Harkness. And what I've really tried to do with this book is put the whole story together. And, as you said for your quote about it, and one thing that you've said in your work so much is that our modern, which is brilliant, is that, that because we have all this access to information now, the modern occult movement is marked by the restoration of context. And that's what I've done here with Dee. And I don't think that you can really understand the guy until you realize how central, how it was all one thing for Dee, whether it was empire building or laying the groundwork for science or the occult. And I think it probably takes a magical practitioner to put that story together, because you just need someone who understands what the occult actually is.
Yeah, it's funny when you do an historical book, because obviously I have as well, and I was talking to Peter Gray about this when we were both working on ours. You think you've kind of nailed down, okay, I'm going to do a book about Dee, and I'm going to put him in context, but it infinitely expands, because, as you just mentioned, you do need someone who's versed in the occult, because there are historic lines that flow into the Dee story, as you mentioned, the Florentine Renaissance being one of them. And you go, it does kind of infinitely expand. And one of the things I liked about this book is it is a competent contextualization of Dee, but it's also kind of personal, because you are a proponent of the Enochian system.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm 100% a proponent of the Enochian system, in the sense that I think everyone and their mother should go out and start doing Enochian magic, and it's the be-all, end-all, ultimate final trip of Western magic, because it's an incredibly intense and intensive and grueling and not, particularly rewarding in the material sense magical system. And it's kind of the thing that if you have a calling for it, well, then you have a calling for it, and good luck. And it truly is a beautiful and remarkable system. But I am of the opinion that Enochian is not only central to the Western magical tradition in the sense that really it has been the core of all Western magic post Dee, and has been, you could argue, at least causally responsible for the creation of not only the Dawn, obviously the core of the system that Mathers cobbled together in the British Library, but also Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism, and you might even be able to argue modern science, along with, of course, Thelema, and through Thelema, things like witchcraft and even modern Satanism to some degree. So I do think that to understand the context of Western magic and what it really is, certainly over the last 500 years, you have to understand Enochian, and it's the master key that unlocks everything. And in fact, I've even argued that, and I think probably some would debate me on this, but I've argued that, my view of the Golden Dawn, for instance, and Thelema, is that these were attempts to some varying degree of success. I'm not saying they were completely successful, but they were attempts to build kind of scaffolding systems or training wheels to allow people to even begin to approach Enochian, which, in my personal experience as a practitioner is, it's like plugging your thumb into a wall socket. It's a type of magic that works almost in the sense that magic works in movies, almost where you just read something off a page and something profoundly happens, unlike with Kabbalah, where you have to jump through all these hoops and kind of force it to work. It's not like that with Enochian.
That is okay. I want to definitely pick up. I think that's a very interesting way of framing that. But before we have that discussion, we should probably, as you say, put the context around it, because I definitely want to pick up its involvement in the Golden Dawn and even, Crowley in the Desert and all that kind of stuff. So, but before we do that, let's ask, how does a cloth merchant's son get to advise Gloriana Regina herself?
Well, let's see, where do I pick up on this? He went and studied and did his master's in the Netherlands, and then kind of became, at least by his own recounting later, when he wrote the Compendious Rehearsal at the end of his life, where he was trying to justify his existence to the throne, he claimed at least that he was the most in-demand lecturer on the entire continent and was just a rock star, filling lecture halls. People were looking into windows trying to get, see what he was saying. And the reason that is because he was one of the first people to bring knowledge of higher mathematics, or particularly geometry, to the public at that time, because he'd written the introduction to Euclid's Elements in English, which was, bringing math to the public for the first time, which at that point was considered the dark arts. But he became so famous, at least on the continent, that he was getting all these offers from European monarchs, the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian, and then in France, and even the Ottoman Empire, all gave him very hefty offers to come and work for them and be their kind of court scientific and mathematic advisor, because this knowledge was so in demand. And he turned them all down because he was a true patriot and he truly wanted to advance the destiny of England. And so he turned them all down and came back to the UK, and they immediately, which was during the Catholic reign under Queen Mary, they immediately threw him in the Tower of London for accusing him of calculating, which is casting astrological charts, in this case for Elizabeth before she was queen. And, he was very likely tortured and then had to recant and become a Catholic again. But once Elizabeth assumed the throne and assumed power, she remembered that, he had done some astrological calculating and casting of charts for her that they had requested because they knew him. And so he was given at least a minor position within the Elizabethan court, although this is sometimes overplayed, and one thing that became very clear as I was researching this book, Dee has very much been romanticized, as I say. Like if you read books about Dee written in the 70s, kind of like in the incense cloud of the 60s and 70s counterculture, people romanticized him as the great 007, the ultimate Hermetic magus of all England. But if you look at the details, he was really kind of an underpaid government consultant who was never given proper payment by Elizabeth. He was always kicking himself for having turned down these offers and spent a lot of his time trying to get, trying to interest monarchs again. And they just probably didn't really care about him much for the rest of his life. Although they did care about Kelly later because they the gold, which is what they all really care about. That they were all interested in magic, but just for this idea of, well, can you make me gold?
Yeah, exactly. There's which we'll come to towards the end because I think it folds into the Golden Dawn story. But there are historiographic challenges with Dee that you kind of mentioned. That because he was so important to the Golden Dawn, 20th century analysis, I think has. He's a remarkable man, and the system's remarkable, and it's not underselling him to say, by contextualizing him, we do, to some extent, have to make him smaller. I mean, Elizabeth had other wizards. She had, Sir Walter Raleigh's half-brother, Humphrey Gilbert. There were a bunch of them kicking around. And I think you're correct. I think if people haven't maybe picked up a Dee book and have just got secondhand information through the course of just generally being involved in the occult or what have you, the picture of him is it requires context, hence the book, I suppose.
Right. And one thing that, I'm sure listeners of this podcast will be interested in that really came out of the research on this is that, okay, we remember Dee as this quite colorful character, but everybody in England was practicing magic at this time.
It's all over the place. Walsingham, Walter Raleigh, Humphrey Gilbert, literally everyone, it seems like it was the thing to do.
Right. Everyone in court and then also common people. And there was an open magical war, as a covert magical war and open magical war between the Catholic and Protestant magical worlds and magical technologies. And so Dee is really just the most probably advanced and intelligent and remarkable magician from this period. But, he's remarkable for the amount of intellectual rigor that he brought to the occult, but he was certainly not alone in it. And, but I will say that although, my conclusion that I came to with this book is Dee himself, I think that his impact on history is actually much more incredible and grandiose and awe-inspiring than even the Golden Dawn or early occult revivals gave him credit for, because they never took into account his geopolitical work. But Dee himself was kind of just an academic, and the real impact of Dee is the way that his ideas and the Enochian magical system have unfolded in the world in the centuries after his death, which is almost incalculable and beyond what the Golden Dawn and Crowley gleaned from him. They really just got kind of scraps from the hem of his robe, if you will.
Yeah, I'm on board with that. The people potentially, and the case with, say, the Golden Dawn and Crowley is that they existed at the height of the British Empire, so that they were like, it was like how fish don't understand water. Like the empire it existed, but we have a more modern understanding of how empires arise and the actual context of the politics, and it's really difficult to emphasize how much of a potent and revolutionary idea the notion of a, Protestant ocean-spanning empire actually was, and its and the telos behind it to do with essentially the end of the world. Like, this is a really big idea. The British Empire is an occult project, and you can't really fault people at the height of the empire from not getting that, because it just seemed normal to them, but it's not, and its geopolitical impact is being felt to this very day.
Absolutely. And this is really the core shocking idea of this entire book. And it's simply, with Dee, what he was, when you piece the whole story back together, when you piece the scientific and geopolitical side with the magical side, what you understand is, well, Dee was the person who coined the phrase British Empire, and it wasn't that he just coined it. He said that the Archangel Michael gave it to him in a scrying session. This was before Kelly. And he propagandized for it, and the cover of the 5-volume set of naval and mathematical calculations that he wrote to make this possible contains an engraving of the Archangel Michael waving the banner of the Tetragrammaton, leading Elizabeth to the New World, which will be an alchemical paradise, an idea later picked up on by Francis Bacon. And he not only came up with the idea and seeded the idea of a British Empire, but he also laid out the schematics on how to do it and pushed the idea of the paradoxical compass to do it, and was involved in all these naval startups to do it, and then spent 10 years talking to angels with Edward Kelly, who essentially said to him, we're going to marry this idea of the British Empire with a spiritual empire, which will be one hermetic super religion for the entire planet, which will unify Protestantism, Catholicism, Judaism, Islam, and even paganism into one new world order, terrestrial and spiritual, that will be under the domination of Elizabeth as the world Protestant sovereign and under the spiritual domination of the angels, with everybody in the world having Enochian scrying tables that they will be able to use to make direct broadband connections to the angels so that we can sort this human mess out for once and for all.
There is something about spirits and empires. They're fans of it. It's fascinating to take a wider kind of extra-dimensional context about where humans even get ideas from in the first place, which is very much an open question from a scientific perspective. And these kind of systems throughout time going like, we want to reshape the physical world, and, it might be better for you, it might not, but you get the same thing with different BVM, similar things of a type, different BVM encounters throughout history. And there's something that makes it eerie, but also there's a smell of authenticity, because it's almost like you can use ambition for empire as a yardstick for authentic spirit contact, because for whatever reason, they're pretty into the idea.
They are. And this is actually, so this is one of the reasons why I've been so excited to have this conversation. And of course, in preparing to talk to you, I finally read all of your books, which I loved. I thought they were brilliant. And the core, the thing that I really want to have a conversation with you about is this idea of course, Crowley at the end of his life in Magic Without Tears says the one great hope for humanity is contacting extra-dimensional beings or praeter-human intelligences, which is something that you pick up on and talk a lot about at the end of Starships. And I think, of course, anyone who's actually had experiences like this, they're kind of left with, well, what was that?
Yeah.
It's like they're just so bizarre. And so I've been excited to have this conversation to talk about this as from a practitioner sense, instead of, in a lot of the podcasts I've been doing, it's mostly focused on explaining what magic is. But that's really the core of this whole question. And that just like, what is that,
Well, this is obviously very much my jam. I like talking about this stuff. And I think if you put a flow model under D, so here's my thoughts. I consider D to be a fulfillment of the Grimoire tradition rather than a break, because if you look at the influences, and actually we do need to talk about how he and Kelly did their thing, but if you look at the sort of Grimoire tech that he used, particularly building out the Enochian system, you see kind of like Almandal, you see the Heptameron, you see Liber Geratus, and obviously Trithemius, because he's, into his cryptography and all that kind of thing. So if you look at what the sort of point of grimoires are, it is to essentially initiate first contact. And at that point, it's up to you and the entities to carry on that interaction. And so there are kind of a few people, at least writing in English over the course of European magical history, that really took that idea to its completion. And Dee stands out as that one. Like it might have been using, which is what the grimoires are for. They're the step one to kind of get you in the door. And at that point, it's up to you and the entities. And what's interesting to me about that is sliding that into the flow model is, as you kind of said, there's really no Golden Dawn without the Enochian system. And as a result, there's no Crowley without the Enochian system. And as far as I'm concerned, there's no 20th century space program without Crowley. So you put all these things in a line, and all of a sudden you can kind of squint down and go, well, that's interesting. Somebody's playing a multi-century game of empire and space travel and so on. And whether that was the point or whether it's something that they delight in doing at different points in the timeline, there is something there, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. And that's the whole, that's what attracted me to the subject. And of course, with the grimoire, completely agree. Read the angelic sessions. The whole, first few years of the sessions are Dee kind of bringing grimoires to the angels and saying, well, what do you think about this? And them correcting them. So, for instance, the most obvious example is he brings, the original Sigillum de Ameth is from Liber Juratus, and he brings them the Sigillum, and then they give him the updated and corrected version, and and also the Book of Soiga and a bunch of other things. And the fascinating thing about that, the really fascinating thing, is that the angels are kind of looking at that stuff and they're saying, well, that's nice. It's kind of like when a parent looks at a kid and says, well, yes, you almost drew an elephant. It's like kind of like a crude attempt to draw an elephant. And the angels say, and they say very specifically at one point, Europeans have been making fumbling attempts through the grimoire tradition to make contact, as you say. But I think the actual line is, they say they're giving them the true magic from the angels. And the actual line is, this is what they've all played at. Essentially, the grimoire tradition is trying to kind of be the ape of Thoth, if you will. And it's monkeys trying to make a crude approximation of how angels actually communicate and operate. And then they deliver the Enochian system, and there's also some stops and starts with it, where one of the thematics in the Enochian sessions is that they will quite regularly first give them a halfway done diagram. So, for instance, in the case of the Laman and also the watchtowers themselves, they'll give them first a corrupted instruction, and then at some point they'll correct it again. And this happens continually, where they first give them like a bad carbon copy, and then the second, and they'll say, but even though they're saying they're correcting the grimoires, but then the second time they'll come back and say, well, here's what it really is, which is quite maddening and confusing for anyone who tries to approach this practically. But I think, like you say, it's kind of like, well, you make contact and then what? And in the case of Dee and Kelly, the then what was that they were delivered, they were really given everything that all of the entire European occult tradition was trying to get, which was they corrected all the grimoires. They gave them the language of angelic, which, all the whole Hermetic tradition had been searching for hundreds of years. They showed them how to make contact with angels, and then they told them the giant geopolitical plan that they needed to enact. So they were pretty much like, here you go, here's all of it. And then Dee and Kelly's response is, Dee is like, continually saying, well, can we have some money, please? And Kelly is asking them for money. And at one point, Kelly actually asked to borrow money from the angels. And as the sessions go on, the angels just become infuriated with them, as you might imagine, because they come on very strong and are saying, here's all the secrets of the universe. But at the end of it, they're just hanging their heads in woe at these two guys. But I guess I kind of went off on a tangent there.
No,
but,
it's cool. It's as you kind of said, it's there's practical enchantment and there's Enochian, right? Like it's not designed to get you the girl or the job.
It's absolutely not. And Enochian is designed, as I say in the book, if you want to look at it Kabbalistically, it's designed to initiate you into the supernals, right? Into wisdom and understanding, or Hokmah and Bina, which Crowley picks up on later in the Vision and the Voice. And of course, in order to get into the supernals, your personality needs to be turned to ash and destroyed, and your sense of the story you built up of who you think you are and the ego. And all of that is destroyed through the action of Bina, by the action of the sphere of Saturn, which can be personified as perhaps the daughter of fortitude or Babylon, as we see in Crowley's sessions. And this is why Enochian is not, it's obviously advanced magic, but it's also, it's why I think Enochian can be so fundamentally disturbing to people, because it's meant to eradicate you in order to initiate you into the supernals, as it were, which you can see clearly in both Dee and Kelly's records and then Crowley's, although the extent to which Crowley was able to do that is perhaps debatable from his actions later in his life. And, so, he was, well, although you might be able to look at the rest, one might argue, as I think James Eshelman has argued, that, Crowley perhaps did cross the abyss in the desert in Algeria, and what was left behind was the Qliphoth of Aleister Crowley. That's an
interesting way of looking at it.
So, for those who are, know Kabbalah, and I think it might explain a lot.
This is a good point. I think let's talk about the tech journey. So, what do we know about Dee's pre-Enochian career? Who else did he try out as a scryer before Kelly? And let's do that. But let's do the kind of tech preamble, and then we'll talk about how it was, like what system he and Kelly used for the download, if you will.
Totally, and that's a great way to put it. And the fascinating thing is, when you put all this back into context, Dee's intellectual journey actually does make perfect sense as kind of like in a video game, like he's leveling up in a tech tree to get to being able to do the angelic magic. So he really starts out with just broadly studying Hermeticism. And he starts out, his first work is called the Propedumata Aphoristica, which is where he's studying the Hermeticists like Al-Kindi and Roger Bacon and various others. And that one is fascinating because it's really his study of astrology, and he's trying to put, a subject that I know is of great interest to you, which is stellar theology, on scientific footing, where he's really he's talking about building, a real mathematically and physically precise and occultly precise technology for interacting with the stellar rays and the influence of the stars on human souls and on everything else. And so he goes from that work, which nobody really accepted or understood at the time, and in fact he was actually accused of plagiarism. But he goes from that work to the hieroglyphic monad, which he is quite remembered for, which is, the monad is really a sigil that he created that folds in the entire Hermetic universe into one sigil, which is quite fascinating to study. It's really almost a truly masterful expression of Kabbalah, in a way that there's no tree of life or anything like that, but it's the entire universe condensed into one symbol, where he condenses the astrological symbols for the 7 planets, and the cross of the elements, and then the 12 phases of the zodiac, which are related to the 24 elders in the Book of Revelation, which of course are also the 24 seniors later from the angelic sessions. And he brings this to all the monarchs of Europe because he's quite interested in making money at this point, because he's quite poor, as he was throughout his entire life. And he's telling them it has all the secrets of alchemy. And they say, well, can you make us infinite money by producing gold with this? And he says, well, no, but I can bring you wisdom and understanding and insight and enlightenment, which isn't that what we're really all about as human beings? And they're like, GTFO, we want gold. So it doesn't get him very far. But he goes really from studying, you might argue, astrology and Hermeticism broadly, to Kabbalah specifically. And after Kabbalah, he then proceeds to his imperial phase, where he produces the General and Rare Memorials, which is the 5-volume set on the importance of the colonization of the New World. And in order to do that, he builds a spiritual case for it from Trithemius, because Trithemius had his own aeonic model where he was arguing for 7 ages of mankind ruled by different angels, of which the current one was Anael, which was the female angel of Venus, who Dee related to Elizabeth. And he combines this with the idea that perhaps Britain had already colonized America, and that King Arthur, the mythical Arthur, had already established colonies in the Americas, which was not just, it actually turned out to be quite important because they were trying to build basically a legal case as to why Britain had claim to the New World and not Spain. And basically they were just trying to say that the English were there first. So he goes, that's the tech tree that he goes up to, and he presents all of his imperial ideas, the cream of his life, he's almost 50 at this point, and he's spent his entire life doing nothing but suffering he's gone into debt to buy books his entire life. He's been tortured, treated terribly by the court, and all he's been trying to do is gain divine and occult wisdom, and he presents this plan to Cecil, the Secretary of State, and Elizabeth, which of course would be the plan that would later be actualized by Walter Raleigh and other people in order to create the greatest and the wealthiest empire that the world is. And they, of course, and his payment for this from Cecil, the Secretary of State, is a conciliatory gift of one leg of venison for the gift of the greatest empire in human history. So they dismiss him, but of course they later use his ideas. But from that point in his life, that kind of was the end of Dee's governmental career, where there was just a shifting patronage, there was shifting politics at court, where they just didn't really take him seriously anymore. They kind of saw him as perhaps this kind of kooky Terence McKenna type guy that they, thought was amusing up to a point. But they realized that he...
Was any of the this project, is it a solely intellectual project, or was he doing ritual magic? When I say intellectual, was he solely... there's obviously a lot of maths behind it, which is a kind of magic, I guess. But given what he went on to do later, did any of this come from, was he kicking about with actual grimoires, or is this all a mental exercise?
Well, this is the critical point for understanding Dee. And broadly, yes, it was all intellectual. He was an armchair magician in some ways, and he was a hard-headed intellectual guy, and he was building up all of this, elaborate hermetic knowledge, as we often see people doing nowadays, but not actually practicing it. But he was beginning to make efforts into actually scrying and making angel contact around this time starting in his late 40s. But he couldn't do it because he was too compulsively rational and intellectual, and he didn't have psychic faculties. And at one point, he actually contemplated suicide in 1569 because he was trying to contact the Archangel Michael, and he couldn't do it, and nothing would show up in the scrying crystal. And he figured that it was because that he was somehow unworthy as a human being, and that, his whole life had been a sham. And so he contemplated suicide, as he writes in his diaries. But this is where when he starts starting to audition scryers, as you mentioned. And so he kind of had like a headhunter, like a talent scout that he was working with from the English court. And this, who was kind of like looking for scryers for him. And he tried out a few, the most famous of which is Bartholomew Hickman, who begins the 5 books of mystery with a few scrying attempts. But of course, it was not until the infamous Edward Talbot or Edward Kelly shows up that things really start cooking.
And how did Kelly show up?
So he was found by this talent scout, as it were, and he shows up, and it's recorded in the diary that the moon turns blood red on the day that Kelly shows up. And of course, he's an imposing sight. He's half Dee's age. He's 25. He's an alcoholic. He's clearly mentally unstable. He's overweight. He's had his ears cut off for forging coins. There's this miasma, this cloud of brimstone that follows him, where he's been accused of necromancy and Goetia. And of course, he probably was playing around with the Goetia a lot, which the angels pick up on very quickly and are very upset about. But he kind of shows up and ingratiates himself into the Dee household, which, Dee's Mortlake was not like a Hammer horror setup. It was a busy house. He was married. He had 9 children. There were lots of servants. It was a busy household, and they started doing scrying sessions basically just in Dee's study behind closed doors while everything else went on in the house in broad daylight. but Kelly really ingratiates himself, but proves very quickly that he can actually do it, that he has this, despite being such a bizarre character, like, of course, anyone who's interacted with psychics or met a lot of psychics knows that psychics often aren't the most grounded people. And also a lot of psychics don't approach the technical skills of magic, which I think can be quite important for psychics as a way to structure their psychic abilities and use things like banishing rituals to enforce energetic boundaries and that type of thing. And a lot of modern magicians have no psychic capacity whatsoever, so it becomes a dry intellectual exercise for them. But with these two men form a working partnership where they get both ends of they get it going. And I often think that, as an aside, this is often how magic best happens. In my experience, magic works very well in partnerships or small groups.
Yeah, and it's important, I think, for people to realize that going back to at least the 11th century, we have documents of like Caesarius of Heisterbach and so on. Basically, this idea of a magician, as you say, who maybe doesn't have psychic faculties, will use a scryer. European versions of it historically used small children. One of the things that defines the English Renaissance, and I think is healthier, is that they used adults. And Kelly is one of them. But let's talk about the actual system, because this is a good point. What did a scrying session look like when they were getting this information? Like, how did Dee open it? Did Kelly just sit there and look at the mirror? What went on?
Surprisingly uncomplicated. And not what we would recognize as kind of like all the rigmarole of Golden Dawn type ceremonial magic. Although I actually think that stuff helps to structure these sessions more than what the technology that Dee and Kelly were using. But basically what it was is Dee and Kelly would go into their study, or Dee's study. They would close the doors. They would set up a scrying crystal, which, by the way, as you know, because they put this on display at the Royal College of Physicians, is not the scrying mirror that's in the British Museum.
That's my next question right here. Does the obsidian mirror in the British Museum really belong to him?
It might have belonged to him, but nobody knows for sure. But one thing is for sure is that it is not what they used in the scrying sessions. No. And in fact, a lot of those artifacts that are in the British Museum outside of the actual sigillum, which was Dee, are actually things that later magicians recreated from Casaubon and have been falsely attributed to Dee, which is kind of shocking. But anyways, so the actual thing that they scryed with looks like a keychain. It was a little like multifaceted piece of glass or crystal that was kind of hung from a key fob that it was about maybe a half inch in diameter. And that they would shine it into sunlight and use it to scry. Although later scrying implements were later manifested in the Angel Uriel it's this keychain, the Angel Uriel, or the crystal in it. The Angel Uriel just makes pop out of the air and fall in front of them at one point. So, but the way that it worked is the methodology was very much like Abramelin, in that Dee would simply humble himself in prayer. And, the thing we always see in the medieval grimoires, where the whole operating methodology is, groveling before the divine and saying, I'm unworthy, I'm not fit for divine wisdom, but please, pretty please, if you might maybe just look on me kindly, could you, maybe show me the secrets of the universe? And that's kind of what he does. It's just long, at length praying to Jesus and the angels by Dee. And then once he's suitably exhausted by that process, then Kelly sits down at the crystal and starts to, of course, scry and trance out. And anyone who's done scrying knows that it's really just a way to get into an altered state of consciousness. And that's what he's doing. And then Kelly starts to transmit the psychic information that he's getting, and Dee starts writing it down. And of course, over the 7 years, they are then out of that process given this immensely complex Enochian system, which is kind of like this circuitry board or instructions for building the world's most complicated Ouija board, which they then build. And then that, becomes the way they make contact, which is much more ritually precise and complex, very complex.
It's interesting to consider the tech development from that point, because you do have a comparatively simple process that initiates the contact, and then you get a system that kind of allows you to dial up the signal strength, and I think that's a really important shape of extra-dimensional interaction, because you can kind of match that to spirit systems around the world. Not exactly, but that general rhythm from fairly simple make contact, as a result of contact, build your, build your radio towers and get better contact. And it's almost like not an arms race, but it's an improvement from both sides of how that works. You even see that with kind of classic spiritualist sessions, like the Skull Experiment, for instance. Starts off simple, gets quite intense, gets better ways of interacting, and it sort of balloons from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think one important technical point to make about this for practitioners is that the construction of the Enochian furniture was meant not just to, of course, it was meant to intensify and boost the signal, and also to attune them to, what the Enochian universe is like. And really, the Enochian the furniture is really a map of the universe, but it's also meant to buffer the sessions so that it becomes like a banishing circle. The angels call eluders, which are demonic spirits and entities that are constantly trying to interfere with the sessions, and that they're constantly having to exorcise from Edward Kelly's field, because he had practiced Goetia and was actually continuing to secretly practice Goetia during the sessions, which leads to a lot of crosstalk. And it takes them a few years to sort that out and get Kelly straightened out, and even get him to admit that he was doing that. So as an aside to that, a lot of the messages that come out of the Enochian system, like for instance, there's this infamous passage called the Horrible Doctrine, where the angels tell them that Jesus is not real, that there's no sin, that reincarnation is real, that and all these other things that kind of sound like modern New Age Neoplatonism, or excuse me, not Neoplatonism, kind of New Age neo-paganism. And Crowley picked up on this in Liber Aleph and said his take on it was that the angels were trying to transmit the law of Thelema, like a post-Christian conception where sin is not real and Christ is not real and everyone should just kind of chill out. However, and then of course, and Crowley's take on it is that, well, Dee and Kelly had too much Christian baggage, so they couldn't understand the incoming of the Aeon of Horus. However, if you look at, and you read the translation of the Latin and you look at the context of that, again, Kelly admits after that is transmitted that I was actually doing a lot of Goetia also, and actually the Goetic spirits told me this, which is a point of some importance. But my original point is that the Enochian furniture is meant to buffer and keep out crosstalk and eluding spirits, and also buffer out the energy, because the energy of the Enochian system, when it impacts on somebody, is incredibly intense. And the furniture mitigates this. And this is one of the reasons why I think that, Enochian has, in some cases, really picked up a bad reputation following people like Paul Foster Case and Israel Regardie, kind of, saying, well, it leads to spiritual burnout. But I think one of the reasons why it's picked up a bad reputation is because people have been approaching it either just wildly or using the interface of the Golden Dawn. And of course, the interface of the Golden Dawn it's beautiful, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the original material that was transmitted by Dee and Kelly. And certainly Crowley's take on Enochian, while fascinating and beautiful in the vision and the voice, is also, full of Crowley's own, it's full of Crowleyisms. So that was a bit of a ramble, but yeah.
No, it's good. It's interesting that the wires are still hot, even when even if you've sort of like jailbroken the system, because my first ever experience of speaking the words was actually from the Satanic Bible during we'll just chalk that up to a teenage phase. And when you were saying at the beginning of the show about there's something kind of instantly crackly about it that has that smell of authenticity, whatever it happens to be, even in such a debased state, because let's not even bother going into how that was translated and used and so on. There's still something to it, if that makes sense. So it's fascinating to see it have to be potent enough to still be used in off-book ways, I guess.
Right. Well, it'll blow your head off, right? And it'll work. And for instance, like doing the Golden Dawn stuff, it's not that it doesn't work. It works quite well. The issue is the wire insulated, right? Or are you just like getting a live wire transmission that blows you out without having done the proper preparations in the same way that, you're not going to do like high octane yogic or kundalini raising exercises without having gone through the preliminaries of asana and pranayama and dharana and long preparation of your nervous system. And one thing that I think we probably share in common is that when I was first learning magic in the 90s and the early 2000s, the occult discourse at that time was totally dominated by chaos magic and the idea that it's not really real, and you can fake it till you make it, and you can make up your own system, and you can remix and mix and match. And, that never quite sat well with me. And at that time, everyone was saying, well, you don't need to learn Kabbalah, you don't need to learn Enochian, all this is, it's all old school. And that never really sat well with me. And so, my chaotic rebellion against chaos magic was, well, I'm going to get really, really serious about this. I think that one of the things I tried to do with this book is bring out that there is a serious Western magical tradition that must be taken seriously as another branch of the sciences almost. I mean, really in my opinion, what the Western esoteric tradition is, at least in its form post-dating Dee, is the branch of the Western intellectual project that was concerned with building a scientific and precise approach to interacting with the spirit world, just like physics or, bioscience or something like that. And that it was abandoned after the scientific reformation and has kind of been languishing. And but that, in our current moment, as we've seen in our lifetime, as people have become so fascinated with magic again, they have begun to approach magic from the kind of, I won't even necessarily say postmodern idea, but from the very, very current idea that it's not actually real and that it's all kind of aesthetics and outsider signifiers and subculture posturing. And that if it works, well, then perhaps it's really just, a language for getting your unconscious to do something, or you've just tricked yourself into doing something. But I think that anyone who's spent, a lot of time doing magic, which for me is now 2 decades, it's like, at a certain point, that becomes obviously not the case. And of course, one of the things that I think that you brought forward really clearly in your work is, look, all you have to do is go and interact with people in other cultures and see how they approach the spirit world and how real it is for them, and also how precise of a technology it is. And Western people, Western people think they're a big deal when they learn magic. They think, well, I'm the magus of the new aeon, but then you go to somewhere like Thailand or Kathmandu, where I spent a lot of time, or Mexico, or, really anywhere outside of the bubble of hyper-mediated Western society. Well, everyone's a magician, it's not a big deal, but they have much more advanced ways of doing these things than Western people. And I've kind of come to the conclusion that, people from cultures that have not rejected spirit, who still live in a spirit immersed world, kind of look at us and Western people as kind of like cats with their whiskers cut off. Like there's just something off about us and there's something missing. And that something is our connection to spirit, which I think people know they're missing and is the missing piece of their soul. And I think that's why there's so much interest in magic now. But what they really need to understand is, as and I think probably most of the people listening, and probably all of the people listening to this podcast know, that it's not, it is an art and it is a science, and there are procedural steps, and you can't just, make it up.
No,
or you can, but only at a certain stage.
I think that was a premise, and potentially a good one. That sort of, I would call second wave chaos magic in the 90s, which is you can do anything and you can swap Apollo for Superman because it's in the Bob Wilson inflected, it's all in your head kind of thing. And I think that was a premise. If you do it, you very quickly work out this is a false premise. There is something to it, and in a weird way, I consider. And again, it sounded like a good idea at the time. We didn't even have access to the same sort of psi data, like actual lab tested psi results that we have now, or something like the Stargate program and so on. When these ideas were sort of put out there, it's like, well, maybe you can just do anything. And unfortunately, and I don't want to sound too mean about this to people who are beginning their magical journey, because you can start there. As long as you do it, you will quickly move out of the shallow end, right? And I just, yes, there's something about second wave chaos magic that I'm doing my best. I joke that I'm like St. Ignatius for chaos magic because it's the second wave I have a problem with. So it's kind of like a counter-reformation. It's like, no. These things are just premises. They're not things you can believe and use to be lazy. But I guess this begs the question, right? If we're talking about spirit ontologies, in your estimation, and this is good because there appears to have been in the reception of the Enochian system a ontological difference between goetic spirits and Enochian angels. So in your estimation, and from your experience, and you can fold in what Dee and Kelly thought about this as well, what even am the Enochian angels?
Okay. A lot of different that. Many ways we can look at it. So I'll start off with how Dee and Kelly saw them, which is very clear-cut and straightforward, which is they straight up saw them as the avenging angels of the Old Testament, and the angels made no bones about it whatsoever. They said, we're here to punish humanity and bring about the apocalypse because y'all have really messed up as a human species, and you need to submit to the will of God because Christ is coming back, and the Antichrist is here, and you either serve the Antichrist or you serve Christ, and it's that simple, right? In my personal work, my personal opinions, I'm not sure I have a clear answer because I think that I think you can at least make the argument that whatever the Enochian entities actually are is so vast and profound and beyond anything either that we understand as human beings or frankly that you contact through other magical systems. It's so the energy is so intense and refined and pure and beyond any human capability to capacitate it or understand it at all, even to say like, well, they must be gray aliens or something like that. Well, it's far, far beyond that. And, you know, my experiences of Enochian have been very, very science fiction inflected and very cosmic. But I think that it's possible to make the argument that whatever those entities are, they communicate with people in the language that they understand, right? Which is, I mean, how could it be any other way, right?
Sure.
Because Dee and Kelly's nervous systems did not contain 21st century science fiction metaphors. They contained biblical metaphors and not really a whole lot else outside of just Hermeticism. So,
but even
and then,
the
of course,
original compilers of the Old Testament, it would have held for them as well. So you kind of can pull that story back and go, well, yes, whatever happens in these encounters, we bring a lot to it.
Sure. And then I think that then the question becomes, well, is humanity's spiritual knowledge and capability to capacitate higher forms of spirit, which is, of course, an argument that Crowley makes with the New Aeon and the Knox formula and all this. Are we actually progressing over time and getting able to better capacitate more real revelations of spirit, or are we regressing, or just staying completely the same? And, when you're a young magician, when you are first starting out, you, of course, get bought into the idea that, there's some great spiritual revolution coming, or a new age or a new aeon, and everyone's going to be enlightened, and it's going to be one big ecstasy-fueled Buddha rave at the end of history, right? And it's not quite the case, as you find out if you continue on with magic over the years to come. But it's quite easy to get into a teleological view of magic, where which is the error that so many religions make, where that humanity is approaching some final destination, or omega point, as Teilhard de Chardin and Terence McKenna would argue. But it kind of just becomes New Agey Hallmark card thinking at the end of it all, and so we have to ask, well, is humanity progressing? Is it regressing? Is it really dependent on a human to human basis? Are we all over the place? Are we just staying flat? I don't really know. But, what I do know for sure is that what you bring to magic will, of course, influence what you get out of it, because it couldn't be any other way. Because the only thing that whatever these entities are, the only thing that, the only prima materia that they have to interact with is what's already in your brain and your nervous system, right?
Yeah. I think, all right, I'm going to re-describe how Dee and Kelly saw it, and let me know what you think. So, the Enochian angels are not a description for the entirety of the spiritual ecosystem. They are a very specific subset, however intense, of entities within a spiritual ecosystem. And that's very early modern English. Like, if you consider how they were conceptualizing the fairy realm, sometimes it was on the other side of hell. So they had different components of the spirit world realm where things would live. Demons, angels, specific kinds of angels, etc. Do you think that holds today, that it is not a description? So it's not a way of accessing the entirety, and it isn't a taxonomy of the entire spirit world. It is a very specific description of a specific class or collection or nation or what have you of entities. Would you say that is a reasonable description?
Yes, I would. And, just to be clear, there's not a difference between Enochian angels and angels. It's the beings that they contact in the angelic sessions are the angels, and they, for the most part, are the lower ranks of angels, the angels and archangels, although they begin to get apparitions that are higher up the classical, Neoplatonic scale of angelology. However, practically speaking, and the angels are clear about this at the point of a flaming sword. They make no bones about the fact that demons are demons, and they are evil spirits and illuders, and particularly anything that even bears the slightest brimstone whiff of Goetia, they loathe, and they want to destroy it, and they also spend years just clearing that stuff off of Kelly, because they can't even get a clear channel through to him until they've got the demons out. Now, that said, it kind of becomes clear as the sessions go on that the angels view demons kind of like as a teaching tool, because what the angels are concerned with over everything else is the spiritual salvation of human souls. And so there are lots of sessions in the angelic sessions where Dee and Kelly are confronted by demons that give them absolutely horrifying visions of hell and their own potential futures. And at one point, they're shown Mortlake destroyed, and Kelly's or Dee's wife killed, and his children killed, and all this stuff. And the demonic visions they see are just absolutely harrowing. And the attitude of the angels is that they're trying to clear the demons off them, but they kind of also have the attitude of, well, now you see, right? Get it? This is why you need to be, this is why you need to be saved, because it's one way or the other, and it's black and white for them. Now, that said, you could glibly make the argument that, well, perhaps demons and angels are different registers of one type of being, but I don't think that's borne out by the session quite so clearly. And I think that the angels and demons are very clearly demarcated in the sessions. In terms of the modern day, I think that absolutely holds true as somebody who's, experimented with both Enochian and Goetia. But I also think that, one thing that we need to be clear about in our current cultural context is that there are also tons of classes and taxonomies of spirits from other cultures that have nothing to do with the spirits of Western cultures, the angels and demons of Western cultures, and are quite different and have totally different attitudes to morality and what a human life should be, and one of the things, the traps that Western magicians fall into is the idea that, oh, well, it can all be kind of syncretized to 777 tables. Well, no, it can't, because the spirit world is as varied and complex as the human world. It's full of all kinds of beings, and they're very different from one culture to the next.
Yeah, that's kind of where I wanted to go with it. I wanted to demarcate the difference between having what I think is an essential and probably quite good premise, which is, and was, I would contend, the original, as far as we can see archaeologically, the original belief system of humans, which is effectively the spirit world, right? And so you'll have different tribes and cultures and nations and whatever interacting with different beings and having different ancestors and lineages and so on. But the kind of one universal component of this cosmology that they share is a spirit world, which is why they can interact. They're like, oh, well, you have these spirits, we have these ones. It's a big spirit world, baby, And I kind of think that's where I was trying to, for people who are coming to the story of Enochian cold, I wanted to situate it in this wider idea that is a premise. I think it's a very good one, that I think is sort of essential in the 21st century as we do explore non-Western modes, and we do embark upon comparison and dialogue and trialogue between different systems. That I think the thing we need to slide under it, including Enochian, is that macro conception of a spirit world.
Yeah, absolutely. And my practical approach to this is, if you're going to learn any, it's Tantra or a Buddhist magic or something like that, the way to learn it is not to take those gods off Wikipedia and shove them into the basic schema of a chaos magic ritual, summon them up, and then ask them to give you $20,000 or something like that, or a new car. That is absolutely not the way to do it. The way to understand other magical systems and cultures is to go and humbly and learn from that culture in context. And you have to, and one of the great things about the modern world is it's quite actually easy to do this, in big cities in certainly America or the UK, because so many representatives of these traditions have now come to the West, which was not the case in the time of the Golden Dawn, where you don't have to resurrect this stuff out of the British Library as Mathers did. No, you just go and you put your hat in your hands and you humbly try to learn from people who are there and actually know what they're doing. And that's kind of my approach to, it's not even cultural sensitivity in magic. It's just basic common sense. It's like you just go experience it and learn it in context, and don't try to make yourself the master of it. Go learn humbly.
So we mentioned the Golden Dawn and the British Library and so on. How did Enochian come to underpin the Golden Dawn a few centuries later? Like, where did it go after Dee died? And how did it end up being at the base of that sort of invented Freemasonic structure of the 19th century?
So this is a fascinating process. And the first thing that will shock a lot of people is that, of course, a lot of the Dee sessions have just been lost. And they've been lost for two reasons. One is that all of the diaries, which totaled, there were like 10 or maybe 20 books at some point of diaries, were buried in a chest in a field by Dee. And they weren't dug up until, I think, after his death, by a servant who then began to, much like the Nag Hammadi codices, by the way, then it's same story, then began to use the diaries as kindling for the fire, and burned a lot of them before somebody realized what was going on. And then from there, the remaining diaries made their way to Elias Ashmole, the famous antiquarian, who, of course, is central to the birth of modern Freemasonry. However, there's another part to this story, which is that, which came as a total shock to me, which is that after Dee and Kelly parted ways, Dee returned to England and was kind of put out to pasture as an academic in Manchester. He then continued to do scrying and spent 10 years doing more scrying sessions with another scryer. And there was another 10 years of material produced. Dee, for whatever reason, and I think that actually, the reason was that the angels kept telling them that the end of the world was set for 88, and Dee took that to mean that it would be 1588, and then 1588 rolled, but they never said 1588, they just said 88, and they weren't clear about what they meant. But 1588 rolled around, the world did not end, and then and then Dee became bitter and burned all of the records from this 10-year, close to 10 years of secondary sessions after Kelly. And so it's possible that most of the best Enochian material could have come after Kelly, because he spent more time scrying with a second scryer than he did with Kelly, but it's all lost. So that's important, because whatever we have of Enochian is fragmentary in the same way that the Dead Sea Scrolls are, or something like that. But so they made their way to Elias Ashmole. Elias Ashmole starts actively experimenting with the Enochian calls. And Elias Ashmole, of course, is one of the very first, or perhaps the very first recorded modern Freemason who possibly may have created the Blue Lodge degrees of Freemasonry. And he was working with the Enochian magic at this time for about 7 years, and so it's right there where Freemasonry is being born. Of course, these ideas also become inspirational to the Rosicrucian movement on the continent, and you can argue that Rosicrucianism, which may have been inspired by Dee and Kelly's movements in Prague, then comes back to England, and when Rosicrucianism impacts England, it now remanifests its ideals, which are Dee's ideals and the angels' ideals, as English Freemasonry and also as the Royal Society. And all of these guys are talking about the Invisible College, including René Descartes and all these people.
Well, that's absolutely where I wanted to, the angels' interest in the British Empire continued after Dee's death, because Elias Ashmole, obviously, we get the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford from him, and it's based on his collection. So alongside building the British Empire, you have this Royal Society, for better and for worse, realistically majority worse, this analytical attitude. Essentially, you couldn't have the British Empire without the way of seeing the world that you get with the early sciences. And the early sciences are championed in Britain by full-blown wizards who are in possession of Dee's material. And that's one of those flow model things I find very interesting.
Absolutely. And of course, let's be clear. I mean, I'm not taking a pro or con attitude to all of this, because the history of the shadow of the British Empire is worldwide genocide, right?
So I've invented this term, which you're welcome to have. There's a difference. I'm not an imperialist. I'm an imperiologist. And,
okay. I like that.
Yeah. So you go, imperiology is the study of it. It is definitely not a moral position, obviously, because I'm not a psychopath, being pro-empire.
Yeah, and I think, of course, learning all this stuff will be very fascinating to anybody who's trying to take a post-colonial attitude towards particularly magic or just the world, and understanding how the spirit world was essentially colonized by angels. Yeah. And then, of course, on the other side of the fence, we have people like Neil Ferguson saying, well, the empire was the best thing that could have happened to, and civilized everybody and was actually quite good. And there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah. What do you, how many millions of dead do you mean by good? Right. Giving India some trains doesn't balance out partition, I'm afraid.
Right, exactly. Particularly when we understand that a lot of the records of the British Empire recording the death tolls in various parts of the empire were illegally destroyed in the 60s. So we actually don't know what the death toll was, but quite a lot, So of course, India...
Is it through that line... Sorry, I've got to pick this back up because I can't keep you for very much longer. Is it through that line, because these documents formed, the basis of various museum collections, is that how it got to Mathers, or was it through the sort of esoteric Freemasonry line, because some of those founders were, of course, Freemasons as well?
It's actually both. And Stephen Skinner makes a really fascinating argument, at least, that there was kind of an unbroken line of angelic channelers at the very high registers of British society, with, very, lords and admirals and very elite people were kind of continuing on the angelic scrying sessions. And you can perhaps draw a line from Elias Ashmole through them to Francis Hockley, and of course through Hockley is one of the inspirational figures of the Golden Dawn. But I think it's both, in as much as the early adepts of the Golden Dawn were absolutely SRIA, esoteric Freemasons, and at the same time they also had contact with angelic scryers like Hockley. And also took a lot of their cues from Francis Barrett, who, by the way, when Scottish Rite Freemasonry started, a lot of it was inspired by Barrett's The Magus, which includes at least a poorly done version of.
He's,
but.
Sorry, I was going to say Francis Barrett is one of my favorite scammers. I love him. I like failed balloonist, plagiarist. He's just one of the most fascinating characters in that, I guess, English magical history. I think he's just hilarious. There needs to be a movie about him.
You gotta love a magician with style, Yeah. It shouldn't all just be like, reading texts on JSTOR and drawing sigils all day. Sometimes you just gotta go out and, put up a hot air balloon with the face of a demon on it or something like that.
Well, this is a good final question to end on. What are your favorite creative depictions, or fictional, or whatever you like, of Dee? Because as we kind of discussed, he was overemphasized, and he kind of matched or mapped to the I guess almost Merlin archetype of the advisor to the throne, and as a result, he's appeared, and the Enochian angels and so on have appeared in fiction pretty much the last couple of centuries. So, do you have any sort of favorite Dee-ish novels or films or TV series?
I do. My absolute 100% favorite one is the Derek Jarman movie Jubilee, right? Mm-hmm. Which, of course, opens with Elizabeth and Dee scrying, trying to contact an angel and scry the future. And the angel Ariel, which is an angel from the Tempest, not from Dee's session, shows up and I think is played by Adam Ant, if I'm correct, and then teleports them into the future, where they immediately are confronted with English punk kids blowing up cars and running wild in the street and attacking their elders, and are just horrified by the end of the world. And that's it's just a beautiful, beautiful movie. So that's probably my favorite fictional depiction of Dee. And I think it really gets to the core of what Dee was about also, which is, and what you get from studying Dee, which is juxtaposing the deep, profound spirituality and seriousness of both Dee's magic and the Elizabethan age in general, and juxtaposing that with our, our fallen world now, like and juxtaposing the quality of consciousness of Elizabethan England versus now, and putting those, it's pretty profound to put those two things next to each other. Nice.
Have you seen Requiem yet?
I haven't. It keeps popping up on my Google alerts. So should I watch it?
Oh, it's fun. It's probably my favorite depiction of the eeriness, perhaps, of the Enochian system. So it's not historically accurate. It's essentially a Welsh ghost story, right? But it's good. It has the same relationship to the original Dee material as maybe a Dark Song has to Abramelin, which is none at all, except that it's atmospheric, and it's totally worth it. Yes, that would be maybe my favorite off the top of my head. I also liked them when they're eerie. I don't know if you ever read Ackroyd's The House of Dr. Dee. Early 90s.
I haven't,
novel.
although I love Hawksmoor by Ackroyd.
Yeah, there you go. This is his creepiest novel, and it's a Dee novel. And yeah, those would be my recommendations for people listening. Requiem, which is on Netflix now, and if you can find a copy, I had to buy an ex-library copy in Cornwall because it was difficult to get, but Amazon.com may help you with like the 1 cent secondhand books when it comes to House of Dr. Dee. Well,
awesome.
All right, Mr. Louv. This has been a great chat for people who are kind of going to, want to know more about yourself and the book and so on. Lay it on us.
Okay, so the best place to go is johnd007.com, which has, all kinds of resources and where you can get the book from. Also, you can read excerpts and dig in further. If you're interested in me and my work, check out jasonlouv.com. where you will see links to all of my social media, of course, but everything, my other 7 books, and there's tons of blogs and podcasts, and the Ultra Culture blog is there, and tons and tons and tons of material, and of course magic.me, which is the school at which I teach all these lovely subjects. So that's where to go.
Nice one. Well, congratulations, and yeah, this was a really fun chat. It's always good to dig into Dee. So thanks very much.
Yes. Thank you, Gordon. That was a great chat.
Angels, scryers, empires, thieves. Very good times. I really liked where this conversation with Jason went in terms of ontologically situating the Enochian angels in a wider spirit model. It's entirely understandable given the access to documents they had at the time, but the prominence of the Enochian system with the Golden Dawn has led to it being, I guess, unevenly emphasized for much of the 20th century. Today, with access to a much greater range of grimoiric material, a clearer understanding of Dee's historical context, and one or more better worldviews in which to think with the system, it seems like it's been freed up. Now that it doesn't have to be everything, sitting resplendent atop a hodgepodge of Goy Kabbalah, Tatwas, and quasi-Masonic body gestures, it gets to be something. It gets to be a remarkable example of what can happen when broadly grimoiric magical techniques are diligently applied, as well as being a remarkable example of the kinds of things that are on the other end of that particular phone line. So check out the show notes for links to Jason's work if you want to know more. I've also put the video from the Dee exhibit we discussed at the bottom of the post page as well. And that's all she wrote. Subscribe, share, let me know what you think. Hit me up on Twitter where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.